Great. So really happy to be here with everybody. I'm going to pin our guests. And let's see, gotta find where Ben is. So really happy to be here today with Professor Rachel Brahinsky and Ben Peterson from Public Works for this month's June's Inspecting Our Foundation. How many folks have looked at Inspecting Our Foundation? Can't see your hands, but I'm hoping that many of you have seen Inspecting Our Foundation. It's our public works history through a racial equity lens. And I'm also hoping many of you haven't, and so you've shown up today to kind of hear more about it. We took on Inspecting Our Foundation as part of our racial equity initiative. We looked at our over 100-year history of public works and examine what our department's role has been in the creation of the city, and we could have done better from a racial equity point of view, where we were involved in different actions. So want to give a big thanks to Ben Peterson, who's with us today, who is the main researcher and main writer on that document. It's an incredible document that actually we had a group present it yesterday at the AIA National Conference, and we get a lot of accolades from other city departments. And then also Julian Pham, who was the creative director of it and really created the incredible interactive aspect of the document. I'll put the document in the chat in a moment, but so as many of you know, each month on Thursday, the last Thursday of the month, usually, we have an Inspecting Our Foundation program that works off of this document. So we've had, last month was on the Chinatown alleys. We've had Indigenous perspectives on land and water. We've talked about the Western Addition. And we're really excited today to bring in Professor Rachel Brahinsky from University of San Francisco, who's Ben will give you, hi Rachel, Ben will give you a more detailed bio, but her work really overlaps and really connects with what we do at Public Works. Brief bio of Ben, because one of Ben's greatest recent successes is the Inspecting Our Foundation. He's part of our communication and outreach team at Public Works, and he's got his master's in urban and public affairs from the University of San Francisco. And Ben's been at Public Works for about 4 years. It's been a whirlwind, and he's done a lot of great stuff, including this work. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Thanks, Beth, and hi, everybody. Now I would like to introduce our guest speaker for this month's Inspecting Our Foundation, Professor Rachel Brahinsky. Rachel is an expert in the fields of urban studies and critical urban geography, and like Beth said, she's a professor at the University of San Francisco, both in the politics department as well as in the graduate program for Urban and Public Affairs, which is actually where I first met Rachel and became familiar with her work as well when I was in that program from 2018 through 2020. And again, kind of like what Beth touched on earlier, a lot of Rachel's work really helped inform the Inspecting Our Foundation's report, and also kind of, her classes that she taught me as well, kind of instilled some of the research and writing and kind of analytical skills that it took to write the report and kind of do some of the programming that we've been able to do as a department afterwards. Specifically, I drew upon her past research and writing on the role that redevelopment played in the Fillmore and Western Addition neighborhoods in San Francisco, and how a lot of her research kind of focuses on the impacts of these programs, a lot of in-depth storytelling and research on the impacts of on these communities and families and individuals that were either displaced or had their lives really drastically altered by these larger government programs. Whereas I used a lot of government documents, old Public Works annual reports, and news coverage from the time to talk about Public Works' role in things like redevelopment. I drew upon the work of people like Rachel to get kind of the other side of the coin and learn more about or express more about the impacts that these policies and programs had further down the road. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Rachel Brahinsky.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic introduction. Hi, everybody. It's really great to see your names and meet you in this way. I hope to meet you in person sometime for more personalized interaction, but it's great to meet you now in this way. And thanks so much to Ben and to Beth for inviting me to join you to talk about all of the things we're going to talk about today. Yeah, and I wanted to just say one thing before we kind of get
Mhm.
into the dialogue. I was first of all, it's especially a pleasure to participate in building on, the work that you all have started through this report that Beth was just describing, which is really fantastic. I was just giving it an in-depth read recently and just kind of seeing, the depth of analysis and the different directions that you're taking these questions in as an institution is really, really important and not easy. And so I just really kind of hats off to you, Ben, and to everyone else who's been involved. I was especially happy also some of the interns who supported the project were students of mine over the last couple of years at USF. And I have a lot of students who come through. You all may have met various USF students. A lot of them have come through my classes, and I spend a lot of time working with them on kind of a similar, in a way, I have a mission in my classes when I'm working with students who are working in the city to do a lot of the kind of thing that you're doing in this report, Ben, which is both like deeply engaging in the work and questioning it at the same time. So looking at the history of the agency and the city and various communities across the city and maybe even the region, I would suggest, and kind of thinking about, what is your relationship to all of that, and how do you think about racial equity
Mhm.
in this particular moment? There's this since George Floyd, there's been this kind of claim that we're in a period of racial reckoning, and I would say that for some people that's true, and and there's also been a tremendous backlash against it. And this is what always happens historically, is right, there's a push in one direction and then there's a push back. And so it takes some kind of moral and I think intellectual and committed steadiness to kind of stay the course to the idea of, okay, we're going to really study our history, look at what it means to think about racial equity in the context of this agency, of this city, of these communities, and then continue to do it and not just write a report and tuck it on a shelf. And so I'm just really happy to be participating in this process with you all. And there's lots more to say, but Ben, I'll send it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I think you touched on a really good point with us being in just very uncertain times, both as a city of San Francisco and on a wider scale as well. That plus the fact that Public Works has its hands in so many different parts of the city. It's always important to kind of maintain that kind of reflective and kind of critical lens on things too. I wanted to start by kind of asking you a little bit about your background and what got you into the fields that you are in. I looked through some of the titles of your past works and your books and things like that. I'm going to list a couple of them off. Your most recent book is titled The People's Guide to the San Francisco Bay Area. Other pieces that you've written in the recent past are called things like The Story of Property, Fillmore Revisited, How Redevelopment Tore Through the Western Addition, and Race and the Making of Southeast San Francisco. And a couple themes jump out, to me when I read those titles. A lot of like deep historical analysis of like how these phenomenon have changed the landscape of cities like San Francisco, both obviously physically, but also socially and culturally. A lot of focus on racial and social justice, and of course using geography as kind of like the terrain for your analysis too. But what kind of got you first interested in these kinds of themes and topics, and why also have you taken to focusing on the Bay Area as kind of not the main, but maybe like one of the main locations for your work?
Yeah, it has definitely been the main location for my work for a while. How did it happen? I'm trying to think of how far back to go, and I think I'll just go back to my career before academia, which was in journalism. I was a newspaper reporter in the city of San Francisco. And so I was interested in
Mhm.
politics and justice and those questions. I had always been very interested in elevating and uncovering the stories that would be suppressed normally, the untold stories. And my major in college, it's a little hard to describe because it was a design your own major, but essentially I was interested in kind of the social history of communities that are normally not represented in a
Mhm.
variety of ways. And so as a newspaper reporter, I covered a lot of different things, including local elections and housing. But I also was especially paying attention to Bayview Hunters Point. And I wrote about the fight to shut down the power plant, actually kind of both power plants, Potrero and Bayview
Mhm.
Hunters Point, really, for many years. So I covered that struggle that went on for a long time, ultimately was successful long after I had left that position. Um, but it became very clear to me in working with the community in Bayview Hunters Point to kind of figure out what the story was and what they wanted and what this history was and the sort of bigger context around this, these questions of the power plants and the pollution, that this was a community that had been ignored in a variety of ways, and the presence of the power plants was one of the ways, but there was so much more. And so when I shifted to working on my doctorate, doing my PhD, which I did at Berkeley, I knew that I wanted to continue to sort of unpack some of the issues that I had already
Mhm.
been focusing on for some time, for maybe 7 years at that point. And it wasn't clear to me entirely what that would mean. I had a variety of project proposals that kind of came out of me over the first couple of years, but I landed on what became my dissertation and what was called the making and unmaking of Southeast San Francisco. And that was the sort of origin point for many of those articles that you just read titles of. So thank you. Um, and basically I was particularly at that point interested in the Hunters Point shipyard and what was happening there and the fight around cleanup.
Mhm.
This is now more than 15 years ago. I don't want to say how long, when I started kind of really digging into the dissertation. And then in order to explain that, maybe somewhat similar to the process you went through in writing your report, I kind of was like, I think I have to go back 10 years. I think I have
Mhm.
to go back 20 years. And I ultimately
Okay.
went back 100 years.
Mhm.
And and could have gone back further, but basically wanted to understand the kind of fate of this one community across time, and learned and saw and ultimately have begun to kind of develop my own analysis of the ways that a geographic space can become a racialized space, can
Mhm.
become what I think of as a race class space. Stuart Hall, who's a cultural theorist, writes about this idea. As I was reading your report, I was thinking, I want to say this to Ben, that Stuart Hall talks about how race is the modality through which class is lived. Race is the modality through which class is lived. And so um, race and class have this way of working together very tightly in our world. So if you're thinking about racial equity, you have to be thinking about class and capital and their intersections with
Mhm.
identity. And that is what you do, in that research. But in any case, those are the kinds of things that I started to kind of unpack and became more and more interested um, in understanding. I was interested in understanding the Bayview, but also particularly certain kinds of movements. So now I'm working on a book, which I can talk about later, which kind of builds from all of that in a slightly different way, but intersects with all the things that we're going to talk about today. And at some point, I'm going to write about another geography. I'm going to get out of the
Mhm.
Bay Area, but there is this kind of there's so much to unpack. There's a kind of myth that the Bay Area is just kind of a progressive place, and it's been that way for a long time, and that's just the story. And in fact, the thing that I have seen and continue to kind of uncover in different ways is that to the extent that the Bay Area is progressive, it's in this very intense relationship with very regressive conservative forces. The reason the region was the kind of the heart of the labor movement is because of the way that labor was repressed back in the 1880s and 90s. And we could go forward in that way. The other thing, I'll just say one last thing, and then we can jump to other questions, but is just the other thing about that myth is that often the story of the Bay Area that's told is that it's progressive, and it's kind of the examples that people will point to tend to be the stories of white activism across time, and often male-led activism, especially labor, right, gets pointed to as the thing. And there's all of these other stories that I would argue are equally or more important in actually producing the Bay Area that we see as this kind of site of really vibrant struggle and people trying to make real transformation and real change. And equity can only come through those struggles. So I've been committed to trying to research with communities and share those stories that are, that still have not yet been made clear and been kind of elevated in the way that they should.
Yeah, it seems like, San Francisco is a great place, and the Bay Area as a whole is a really good case study for a lot of these phenomena that have taken place in urban centers throughout the United States. The Bayview is a really good example of that as well. It has its own very unique history, but also, you see parallels with a lot of other, Black neighborhoods in other cities, and how they've their history has kind of progressed over the last century or so too. And of course, I'm sure it's also probably really helpful to be able to physically visit and go to and walk around the neighborhoods and places where you're doing this research, you're reading about and interviewing people about, and then you can go see what it looks like today too. So it kind of lends another layer to the analysis and to the research. Another thing that happened in pretty much every major urban area throughout the middle of the 20th century was, of course, redevelopment. But a lot of the research of yours that I've written or that I've read is about the Fillmore and Western Addition and the experience there. So my next question is, even though redevelopment occurred in urban centers throughout the United States, what would you say was kind of unique or different about how redevelopment took place in San Francisco, whether, in terms of how the government approached it, how the redevelopment agency interacted with the people that lived and worked in the areas where they were planning on redeveloping, or how the residents responded to these changes? Was there any kind of unique aspects to it in those regards?
That's an interesting question. I think in some ways, the experience of the Fillmore and south of Market, some of the earliest redevelopment projects that the city undertook were they were also early in the kind of arc of redevelopment across the country. So the Fillmore, it's not the first, but it's early, and so it's one of the first stories that emerges as people start to try to understand, what is this thing? What is urban renewal? Why is that name problematic? But I would say, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, early San Francisco redevelopment was not unique, and that's part of the problem, right? And so I mean, the way that redevelopment has functioned especially at that time, there's the federal mandate to clean up cities, and there's federal money, but it's streamed through the counties and then to the city and county level here. And so there are decisions made that do look different in different cities. It's not all the same, but the kind of tearing through a neighborhood with, at first, very little attention to what people there might think or feel or want is unfortunately very typical. Very, very
kind
typical.
of the one size fits all approach a little bit.
Yeah, the idea that you could take the city as a blank slate and kind of just re-slice it up and say, we've had some issues, we're going to call it blight. That was one of the things, right, is the kind of evolution of the term blight as a legal construct. And so through a set of hearings, essentially, the city, through one agency or another, would argue that an area was blighted and thus required a kind of total cleansing. And so, and planners then would kind of envision like, okay, great, we've got this 10 square blocks, it's blighted, let's like scoop it out and start over.
Mhm.
And that, you know, completely misses the existence of people and businesses and buildings and all of those things. And so that's unfortunately super typical, the kind of blank slate approach.
Mhm.
But then it changed over time, and I know that's part of what you were interested in talking about today. So forgive me if I'm sort of jumping to the next question. Is that kind of where you were headed next?
A little bit, but keep going.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, just the change over time is really important and came mostly from agitation from the grassroots. So that's the thing is to the extent that San Francisco is progressive, to the extent that local government becomes more interested in fair, equitable practices on a range of issues, it's because communities at the grassroots level push for it and demand it. And first they're really marginal, and then they start getting heard, and then sometimes they're re-marginalized, and then they start getting heard again. You know, so it's not necessarily a linear process. It's often really messy and kind of bumpy. So in just the kind of early period in the Fillmore district, there was a pretty quick shift from paying very little attention to what people in the neighborhood thought to creating a set of committees, you know, that were staffed by community members and that were supposed to provide input, but they were problematic in a variety of ways, you know, so we could get into what was wrong with those committees. And but there was a pretty quick shift because there was strong pressure, continual pressure. And actually, in one way, I would say one thing that's unique about how it's played out in this city is, you know, San Francisco's neighborhoods are really important sites of community power historically, or they have had the potential to be. And the redevelopment era coincides with, you know, this time of great turmoil and ultimately a lot of transformation and change on a lot of fronts across the country. And all of that influences the way that neighborhood level organizing happens in San Francisco, which then like you kind of have different stories, right, around redevelopment in the Fillmore, then in the Mission, then in the Bayview, then in other places. And that's actually kind of surprising if you think about it, because San Francisco is so small. It's not you know, it's a major city, but it's not that big, right?
Yeah.
And yet we have remarkably different stories in each of these communities around the same kind of big process of redevelopment.
And would you say that, you know, with this increase in grassroots like opposition and, you know, organizing against the displacement and kind of the destructive kind of impact of redevelopment, would you say that, you know, I know redevelopment like technically like lasted a very long time, even though what we think of like the redevelopment period was kind of like 50s, 60s, 70s. How would you say, at least like the redevelopment agency or, you know, the city government at large, other than, you know, that first kind of reaction to you know, set up the committees and things like that, how have you seen maybe like over the longer period the city government become either more receptive or kind of more transparent or, you know, more inclusive in these decision-making processes? And also, you know, if these changes they've made have actually, you know, produced any material change, or if they've sometimes kind of been a little bit superficial, or what your kind of take is on that as well.
Sure. I think there's been a tremendous amount of change, again, in sort of fits and starts, right?
Yeah.
There'll be an expansion and then a contraction of various efforts, but there is far more community participation now, which is complicated. There's a new book I just saw out that's called The Participation Trap, I think is the title. And it's about a totally different context. It's looking at South Africa, but it's looking at this question of, you know, does more participation lead to more democracy? Does more participation get co-opted or not? Does more participation mean meaningful participation, I think. And so it's a question I think that's always a question. So sometimes you might see sort of surface level efforts, or sometimes you might see very serious efforts that get undermined by other forces. And, but at this point, looking across kind of 50 years of, or more
Mhm.
of city involvement in communities, there is, now you see, flyers in multiple languages, which is tremendously important.
Yeah.
And there'll be community meetings sometimes at different times of day. Now, of course, there's the possibility of Zoom, which kind of creates at least the ability for some people to tune in a different way who maybe couldn't before.
Mhm.
But ultimately, so there are many more venues now for community to participate, and I think there's more of an assumption that you have to at least um, include community participation on your list of things that you're going to do. But then how it meaningfully shapes a given process is always a question. I
Yeah.
was just reading about what's happening in India Basin with the new park, and it looks like it might be kind of amazing. Like it looks
Mhm.
like there may, the that community input has really shaped that park and the kind of presentation of it to look some very, very different than actually maybe any park in the city, in terms of the role of the local community, and a community that's majority non-white still.
Mhm.
So and so yeah, so I think that's my answer, and I hope
Okay.
that's not vague. It's sort of because I think you could kind of drill down to each agency and look at, the planning department has their charrettes, and you all do it in your particular way, but
Mhm.
basically there are many more ways for people to um, learn about what's happening in terms of the role of the city in their neighborhood, or weigh in. But depending who's behind a project, and also, depending on how truly equitable the kind of contracting process has been,
Mhm.
there are a lot of ways that participation can be undermined and skewed. So
Yeah.
that's my sort of windy answer for you. Yeah.
And it also kind of seems like, gathering information and talking to people is one thing, but it ultimately kind of boils down to what you do with that information and who is empowered to make the decisions based off of that information. And it kind of seems like it could be more of like a top down thing or a bottom up, like it of course is, going to be dependent on city leadership, heads of departments, elected officials, things like that, to kind of spearhead these efforts. But also it takes the work on the ground, the rank and file, city staff, or, engaging with community organizers or community groups, and, really getting out there. There's kind of no substitute for actually, getting out and talking to people. And it kind of seems like similar to the point that you made about the new book. Was it the participation trap? I think it was called.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
There's also, you see kind of consistent issues come up with like the same people always get very involved. The same, people that have the most free time, or the most that are already kind of clued into these issues and concern themselves with issues of urban planning and development and things like that. And these are people that are, usually really knowledgeable and, interested, and that's great, but they can kind of sometimes take up a lot of space in the room. And you also kind of have to keep in mind the fact that these people tend to be, more well connected or wealthier or what have you, oftentimes. And that can kind of limit things in another way too. So I
Yeah,
think,
can
yeah, yeah.
can I just respond to that? Because you're making me think about kind of this important moment in urban
Mhm.
planning history here, which is in the 90s especially, there was a lot of the mission was kind of a central place for
Mhm.
community organizing around urban planning issues, and housing was already very expensive, and it was already becoming exponentially more so every day,
Yeah.
essentially. And what organizers there did was um, they would take over the planning department. Sometimes they'd go in and stand on the desks and shut down
Mhm.
business as usual. And sometimes but eventually, over about a decade, that sort of agitation of, and this was linked to what you were just talking about in terms of who has the time, who has the knowledge, the
Mhm.
expertise, who has access, right, to get into these meetings and shape what's actually happening in City Hall. And I say City Hall meaning, the City Hall complex writ large, not just the building.
Yeah.
So they forced their way in, um, but then at the same time they simultaneously developed an outside process of urban planning, which they called pueblote, which was a combination of the Spanish words for place, community, and lot, pueblo and lote, and people. Pueblo has a couple of different meanings. For them, it was community planning in the streets, and they would have their own meetings
Mhm.
and develop very specific concrete plans like, okay, yeah, this place on this particular corner is drawing attention from the city, and the developer has a particular idea. Let's develop our particular idea, so we're not just saying no,
Mhm.
which is a position often that communities end up in. And they had some really interesting successes, and I think the park, I'm actually struggling to remember the name of it right now. There's a park in the Mission that's right next to affordable housing, and it was finally built, kind of finished just over the last 5 years. But it came out of that process of probably 15 years of kind of
Mhm.
agitation, and forcing community voices into the process by developing expertise in the streets. But one other thing that this makes me think about that's important when you think about participation is the cost of living in the city,
Yeah.
right? So there are certain moments historically where you see more people showing up at community meetings and at City Hall. I mean, now when I have, new students showing up at the university and they're coming in for a 2-year program, or they're hoping to stay and establish themselves, and they discover how much they're going to have to pay for rent, they have 3 jobs and they go to school, and there wouldn't be time to show up at a planning
Yeah.
meeting. So this is a driving force for all of these questions of participation.
Yeah, definitely. And also, people only have so much energy in a day. You might be in between jobs 1 and 2 or 2 and 3, and there's a community meeting at 6 p.m., but you just need a break too. So yeah, and to your point, I remember when I was in the urban and public affairs program, we had people in my class that were traveling from as far as like Hollister and Napa for night classes, which is it's its own that's a job in itself, is that kind of commute. So um I also kind of wanted to touch on I'd say more of like the storytelling aspect of these types of um issues and phenomenon. Like, it's easy for someone like me or the people on this call, people that work in local government, or are naturally kind of, or yeah, naturally kind of involved with these things or interested in them, to kind of zoom out and look at the kind of higher level, like the data on stuff. Average income in this neighborhood has changed this much over this period of time, or demographics have changed in this neighborhood, or things like that, which is important information, and it does tell part of the story. But what role do you see kind of like storytelling and sharing the experiences of individuals or families, or people that are living or working in these neighborhoods that are facing this really drastic change? What role do you kind of see that playing in the overall process, not only helping to inform government decision making, but just kind of setting the narrative overall of like what development is and could be?
Yeah, that's a something I think about a lot. So thank you for asking. It's really important. Oh, good. Someone just put the name of the park. That is the one I'm thinking of, Inchan Kajal Park. Perfect. Thank you, Robin. That's in the chat. I think I didn't say the word chat. Okay. But to answer your question, Ben, storytelling is hugely important. And it's one of the things that I've seen in my research a lot, that, for communities, storytelling is a mode of power.
Mhm.
When you don't have access to the halls of power, you do have the ability to tell a story that brings in the communities that are being left out, and reveals, if we go back to redevelopment in the Fillmore, the planners at the time had a story. This is a community that's blighted. We'll treat it as a blank slate and we'll start over. That was a story that they were telling.
Mhm.
And it was a very compelling story for investors, to be able to, because this was public money, but it was also private money, the way redevelopment works. And so that was a story that compelled a kind of forward motion of redevelopment in a particular way across the country. And as in response, communities brought forth the other stories that were in play, which is,
Mhm.
we are here, we have been contributing to this place for a very long time. We are, whether that's tax paying, whether that's mural making, whether that's just living and just being, but the being able to tell a story of, this is what we want, and this is how we agree this neighborhood has some issues, and here's how we'd like to see them change, and we want to
Mhm.
be a part of that. And so retelling the story that writes in the residents of the city, whoever they may be, whether they're housed or unhoused, right? Also, our unhoused neighbors are part of the city,
Yeah.
and writing humanity into the story of, what is the future, what could the future look like in a different way, kind of recognizing, yeah, we have problems and there are
Hmm.
collective problems. So storytelling is tremendous.
Hmm.
I mentioned the book that I'm working on now, which is about women's leadership in Bayview Hunters Point at a particular historical moment, also around redevelopment. But in their case, things looked really different because the destruction of the Fillmore was so traumatic and dramatic and visible in the
Hmm.
center of the city that they were able to use that story to tell their own story and to say, if you want to, we can see planners that on your maps of blighted areas, they called them target areas in those
Hmm.
early reports that maybe you've read yourself as well. They included Hunters Point Hill as a target area. And so the women of this organization, they called themselves the Big Five. There were more than five of them, but at one point there were five, and the name
Hmm.
stuck for a long time. They said, you want to come to the Bayview? Why don't you can come through us, and we will lead this process here. And they made that happen. I make it sound very simple by just stating it that way. It wasn't simple. It was
Hmm.
complicated, and it took struggle, and but they were able to bring Justin Herman, who had been sort of, vilified in the Fillmore as the kind of leader of this very destructive process. They brought him into the Bayview, and they were able to use his office and his power to write a different story for
Hmm.
Hunters Point Hill, where affordable housing ended up covering the hill. It took a long time and it took a lot of fighting, but but storytelling was a key piece of it, to keep remembering, what is development for? What is change for in a city? Who is it for? Who's at the table and who gets to stay at the table as we build it and expand it and transform it?
Great. Yeah, I think that is a really good way of summing it up. And I think there's, like you said, so many similarities between even the different neighborhoods where redevelopment took place in San Francisco, but also so many different stories that can be told. And I'm sure that was just scratching the surface. There's a whole book to be written about that. But I think now it is about time for us to kind of shift over to the open question and answer portion, with about 20 minutes left here. So like Beth just said in the chat, if anyone has a question or comment that they would like to ask Rachel or just to bring up, you could feel free to do so either in the chat or just by unmuting yourself and asking it verbally if you'd like to.
I had a question.
Hi, Robin. Go for it.
Hi, I think that this is such an interesting conversation that I've popped in and out of. But I would love to hear your take on like what has been happening in the past, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years where developers are co-opting the people power movement by like paying community members to come and speak on behalf of the developers, and maybe they're like misinformed or they're incentivized, but like the power of the people has been co-opted. And I've seen rallies outside of City Hall with signs, and then I don't see anybody that I know, like no familiar faces or organizations. So like, can you speak to that?
Yeah, wow. Thanks, Robin. It's an old tactic. It's I would say, and it's probably particularly effective at this moment where the cost of living, as we were talking about before, is so high. It's so challenging to get by in the city. And so the grassroots organizations led by people who were doing it through their own motivation, and with a lot of volunteer labor, have been struggling. I don't know if it's more than ever, but the struggle continues, and it's difficult to simply persist. And so there's always, this actually gets to the participation trap idea, which is that people can be encouraged to show up, and development capital, if it had agency, if it was like a thing that could do stuff on its own. Obviously there are people who make it happen, but sometimes we talk about it as a thing with agency. So development capital is going to do what it can to do exactly what you just described, to co-opt, to whether it's through paying people or whether it's through um, kind of stealing messaging, reframing messaging that comes from community efforts and making kind of very top-down projects sound like they're grassroots. And so I think the main thing I would say is that it's not new. I don't know about the specific story that you're telling, but there are stories like this that go way back, right? And that go back, I'm thinking back actually 100 years, even to paid strike breakers, right? And who it's playing a similar role. And yes, during the Monster and the Mission. Although, so what's interesting there is that despite that, one of my students who just finished right now just did a really fabulous thesis on the Monster and the Mission case, and she interviewed people all across the kind of organizing spectrum in the mission to kind of figure out like what did they do? And a lot of what they did was actually storytelling. So the idea that this building was a monster, the community labeled this development proposal, and this was, for those of you who don't know, a proposal for mostly market rate housing on the corner of 16th and Mission, which has now been transformed through many years now of very intense organizing that had a lot to do, so they labeled it the Monster and the Mission, and they were able to do it early on and sort of took control of the narrative. And now they call it the Marvel in the Mission, because they were able to force the project out of the hands, essentially, of this one developer and into the hands of a nonprofit housing developer who's building a very, very different project. So they didn't say, no, we don't want development. They said, here's the story of what we actually want. We live here. This is our community. We want to stay here. We want more neighbors, and we want to make it possible for those neighbors to be able to survive, right? And to welcome in people who aren't, necessarily the super highest income folks. So I wish I could share my students' thesis with you, actually, Robin, because I think some of the answers to, kind of how she did these incredible interviews, long kind of oral histories, where people really dug in, activists really dug into how they owned the story and, what work it took to continually, it's constant. I guess that's part of the other answer, is that, as I think as city workers, as city employees, you all have to be very vigilant as to what participation means when people show up at a protest, when people show up in your public comment, whatever form that takes, whether it's letters to you, emails, or showing up at a meeting. Where are they from? What are their interests? Were they paid to be there? I mean, that would be an interesting requirement, that public comment that you would have to reveal, just like with signature gatherers now across the state, they have to reveal if they're being paid. They don't always do that, but they're supposed to. But that would be an interesting policy that maybe we should get someone to establish. So that, because that is ultimately very hard, right? It's ongoing, and in your roles, you're trying to figure out, who is the community, who do we listen to, and you are the community as well, like, right, like you're all part of the community. But how do you vet commentary and comments and influence? Follow the money. It's a relevant comment for that one too. Let's see.
Want me to read this one off?
Sure.
Okay. I think this one is from Beth, but let's see. It's do you have any advice for us public servants at Public Works on how we can better listen to and act on community voice? We have a lot of different roles. Sorry, someone's calling me on my desk phone. We have a lot of different roles throughout the city, designing, managing, cleaning public spaces and the public right of way and public buildings. So in your kind of experience, have you maybe seen any like models or examples of like really participatory work in this kind of realm?
Yeah. So I'm going to turn that question a little. I don't know if I have a good model for you, but one thing that I noticed that stood out to me in reading your report, actually, Ben, in the section where you talk about the relationship between DPW and the unhoused population and the police, where DPW workers end up getting sort of recruited to enact the removal of people from sidewalks and their stuff.
Mhm.
And that's been in the news a lot lately. It's often in the news a lot, but lately in particular. Um, and yeah, this comment that I think Beth just added, that, you know, sometimes you feel like you're primarily working for the mayor or for client departments like Rec and Park, and you don't have a choice in policy. I think that was the thing that I noticed in the report that was so interesting, that it is, you are sort of a service agency on behalf
Mhm.
of others, but I think you can still assert agency, the other kind of agency, you know,
Yeah.
power around, you know, refusing to, and this can't be on an individual level, right? Like, you can't put it on one employee to be like, I refuse to do this thing, because that's going to
Mhm.
be very challenging and
Yep.
ultimately not that effective. But as a
Mhm.
unit, to be able to, and I think that's part of what's so useful about this report, and this process that you're going through, as a unit, to be able to look at your work and say, you know, when we're called in to remove people from the sidewalk and to throw out their belongings, we collectively think that that's, you know, shouldn't happen under these particular conditions, or, you know, like, you
Mhm.
can kind of, I think it would be interesting to see if you can sort of develop your own policies, even if that's not necessarily how it's supposed to work, because the
Mhm.
way that agencies change is only by people demanding that they change, and collective efforts at that is also kind of the only way to do it without having people sort of get isolated and picked off. But it is
Mhm.
complicated, right? Because you can have someone in charge who seems to be representative of the communities that you're trying to work with, but sometimes race and class aren't so embedded with each other, right? And
Yeah.
so you can have racial representation in department heads and still differential treatment of communities that ends up looking more like kind of class-based, if not discrimination, then differential treatment, I guess I'll just say. And so
Mhm.
that's really tricky too. But, you know, so I would say having this conversation and having more of these collective conversations about changing the culture, that whatever the culture is of your units that you experience and see, you know, are you enacting orders that you feel uncomfortable with? Well, maybe there's something to yeah, to say about, you know, I'm seeing Beth's follow-up comment. Perhaps we need to remember that as public works staff, we can always ask questions and be curious about the why and how of what we're doing. And that's exactly what I would say, is that you're not only following orders, and, you know, and maybe that takes some storytelling to kind of reimagine what your role is.
Yeah, and that was kind of something I experienced towards the end of the writing process for this report. You know, I didn't have an answer or a conclusion that was, you know, nicely wrapped up and saying, oh, and this is what we need to do, or this is what needs to change. You know, it kind of ends with a question, is like, you know, how can you know, if it is the case that a group of employees, or it doesn't even have to be public works, and anywhere in city government objects to something that they are supposed, or being asked to do or told to do, how does that play out, or how can that step or action be taken? And I think it's conversations like these where, you know, we're kind of keeping that ball rolling and keeping that question an active and live one, because like we mentioned earlier, if we just wrote the report and then stuck it away onto Microsoft OneDrive and let it collect digital dust or whatever, then it, you know, would kind of all be for naught. But I
Digital dust is the worst. It's really,
yeah.
yeah.
I think now would be kind of a good time to maybe ask some of the other folks on the call here with us if they would like to share any of their experience in their work interfacing with the public, you know, whether it be through public meetings, surveys, if folks have kind of more public facing roles, whether it be through like permitting or what have you. If you have any stories or insights from your personal area of expertise that you'd like to share, or to kind of build upon this story. And don't make me call individual people out. I won't
Yeah,
actually do that
I
though.
would love to hear from any of you all, if you're willing, and if we've set it up to be too intimidating, like you have to be critiquing the whole project of Public Works. I don't think it has to be that way. But if you have a story that,
Mhm.
that intersects with what we've been talking about, as Ben said, it would be really interesting to hear, um, or a query. I see one.
Hi, I'm Christine Olea. I'll just share. I've done a lot of public outreach on our streetscape projects and projects that are, envisioned as transformative and revitalizing and trying to reconnect neighborhoods around San Francisco. And I think one of the biggest challenges is getting people to the meetings, and we've tried different times, different locations. One successful meeting that I saw, it was at City Hall, but it had like childcare. And, kids, there were a few tables where you could take your children and, they could color during a meeting. But it's just hard to get a good cross section of San Francisco. And it really stood out when you said, or resonated with me when you said, it's hard for students to go to a meeting because they're commuting from outside the city or they're working 3 jobs to pay their rent. And, it's like you can go through every stage of life or, someone in every phase in their life. And it's like, well, it's hard for parents to go because they don't have childcare. And it's hard for business owners to go because they have, they're working in the evenings when we normally have meetings and they're busy during the day. So it's like, I think one of the biggest challenges, and we always struggle with that, is how do we get public input? Maybe a public meeting isn't the best way to do it because it requires someone to go somewhere outside of their normal routine. But we want public input. And so, I don't know, we're always just sort of exploring new ways, new ideas, but it's this constant challenge of, every time we have a public meeting, how do we really get a group that's representative of the neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, that is a sort of eternal problem, but I think that what I've seen where it's more successful is where you're empowered as an agency to do sort of a multiplicity of types of outreach. So you have that meeting at 6 o'clock, you also have one at noon, and now maybe you also have a couple Zoom meetings, and then maybe some surveys. And I know it's hard to get people to fill out the surveys. I've had that experience, I've seen it, but have surveys. Maybe also, I mean, as you're talking, I was thinking this isn't revolutionary, but to do outreach to the organizations that are already active in the neighborhoods that you're working in and employ them, recruit them to recruit input from their communities, from their kind of sub communities within the neighborhood. So I think if you're able to do lots of approaches to kind of maximize the potential that you get people at least some input, knowing that, all of those things are true that you said, childcare, busyness, and also apathy, right? There's, people, the same reason that people don't, a lot of people don't vote, and it's always kind of surprising to me, but it's the same thing, right? But the more that people can have a meaningful, if you can give people a meaningful experience of participation, I believe that they're likely to come back one way or another. And I'm sure there are studies on that exactly, and I haven't read them recently. It's not kind of, but really just like producing the possibility for connection. And I guess that's the other, so this is sort of my big insight of the pandemic, is that connection is like the primary thing, right, that makes stuff happen. And once we lost the sort of ease of everyday in-person connection, it became more visible to a lot of us. And I think it's something that we all have to kind of actively reproduce now, or produce from scratch now. And that has something to do with this input thing, this participation thing, that it's not just about saying, I want the building to be 6 stories, not 9 stories, or whatever. I want a tree on this corner and not that corner. It's also about connecting and feeling like you're a part of something bigger than yourself. And so being able to make that happen in a variety of small ways would be an interesting project.
Definitely. I think we maybe have time for one more person if they would like to chime in. It's only 2 minutes before the hour, but if we have any other quick additions or anecdotes, if anyone would like to share. Can be a little intimidating. I understand. I guess I would like to bring up, I think it was 2 months ago now, maybe, a couple of folks from our Bureau of Landscape Architecture led another one of these discussion sessions where they talked about a few of their recent projects and their experience engaging with the different communities and the neighborhoods that they did the projects in. I think one of them was the Japantown. I think they planted new cherry blossoms and other trees and stuff in, Julie. I think Julie was one of the people that actually led that. Would you like to share a little bit?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Brahinsky for joining us. Sorry, Professor Brahinsky. So as Ben said, myself and a couple of my colleagues, we did an Inspecting Our Foundation session like this one a couple months ago, and the point of that was to kind of reflect on the wonderful research and the work that Ben and our team did in developing Inspecting Our Foundations. And we took that and we really wanted to see how that could, that sort of thinking, racial equity thinking, how we could apply that to our projects. And we were reflecting on that through our projects. And one of the things that we talked about, because as designers, we're landscape architects, so we're designing public spaces, streetscapes, parks, what have you. And one of the things that we talked about was how we really have to learn about the context of the place that we're designing for. And we really need to, even though like we're as designers, like we typically don't, are not directly involved in the public outreach. A lot of times it's like our client agencies who handle a lot of that. But, it doesn't mean that we don't have a say in that, because of course we do. It's in the work that we do. It's in the design work that we do, because we're designing for a specific community, a specific neighborhood. And as designers, it's really our responsibility to really learn about, do the homework, and really understand what the place is about and what the people are about and the history. So that was kind of the point of that talk. And yeah, moving forward, I hope we can all do something to that regard.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, for me, the idea that history matters is not a small thing. It may be the most important thing, right? And so in each of these projects, you have designers who are educating themselves in whatever way works in your agency to, like you said, figure out who's here, what do they care about, what do they need, what do they want, how does it all fit together? That's great.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Julie. I'm really happy that you were here and raised your hand.
Of course.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see. It is a couple minutes after the hour now. Beth, did you have any other final remarks or anything you'd like to share? Okay. I think with that, I guess I would like to thank Professor Rachel Brahinsky again for joining us and speaking with us today, and for all of you for joining us and participating in this great discussion that we had. So yeah, have a great afternoon, everybody, and keep an eye out for our next edition of this discussion series.
Thanks so much. Great to meet you all. Hope to see you in the real world.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel.
You are welcome. Take good care.